Good afternoon. I am here with one of the cornerstones to Star Wars culture. The great Roger Christian had decided to join me here on the show, and I am honored. Thank you very much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Not at all. It's good to meet you, and one of the great fans out there with doing good work to support this wonderful saga we have.
I appreciate it so much. There's three people I would consider just the most important to Star Wars: George Lucas, Nick Gillian, and then yourself. I feel like that's kind of what makes up everything in Star Wars right now.
Thank you. That's very kind. Um,
So,
yeah, Nick's a great unsung hero too.
yes, yes, and to get started here, I read your book. I absolutely love it. Big fan. I think everybody should pick it up. I'll be putting a link in the description. Everybody definitely give this a read. Um,
Thank you.
a question I had when George met you while you were working on Lucky Lady, how did that first interaction go?
Um, it was very interesting because Gloria and Willard Huyck, who wrote Lucky Lady, and they were at college with George, and they wrote one of his earlier films, and they actually wrote some of the dialogue on Star Wars, and it was them who convinced George when Fox would only give him $4 million to make the film, and we were half the price of America in England, and convinced him and said, "Come down and meet what John Barry and myself are doing as a set decorator." And we become great friends with them. We were kindred spirits, all of us. So that was, the first kind of introduction was George arriving with Gary in his plaid shirt, jeans, and sneakers, and that's all he took with him ever. And just the simplicity of it, and what immediately connected to him, he picked up a shovel. I was shoveling salt to make the salt factory, picked up another shovel and shoveled some salt with me. That, a big, loud, brazen American director would never do that. So the conversation about he wanted to make a science fiction movie, and I was very honest and said I never connected to any movies before that, and I love science fiction. I read a lot. And when he said, "Well, I'm trying to make a spaghetti western in space," I was hooked. I mean, that was the connection with us, because I kind of, my mentor was Kurosawa. I watched everything and studied him. And of course, Sergio Leone used Kurosawa's samurai movies, just adapted them into the West, And I later found out that George, how much he'd also admired the samurai movies and the spaghetti westerns. So we immediately had a common kind of connection between us. And I realized, I worked with enough loud and screaming American directors and all of that stuff to see this was going to be different. And of course, I'd seen THX, and really liked it, and thought, wow, here's a different filmmaker who does stuff in a way that it was very reminiscent of Alphaville that Jean-Luc Godard had made, which was one of my favorite movies at the time. And it's interesting because years later, David West Reynolds, the head of literature then, he told me that that was one of the few posters that George had up on the ranch, was Alphaville. So we had a spiritual and creative connection. It's like destiny struck.
Well, and like the big thing too, and it kind of really my favorite thing about Star Wars is the whole like lived in and used universe like aspect of it. And it seemed like you were talking about in your book that you and George really like met on that. Like that was something like you both really saw eye to eye on. Can you tell me a little bit about like his ideals and how it kind of met with yours on that type of thing?
Well, when I was talking to him shoveling salt, I said to him, I see spaceships not as these shiny new things. I see it like an old car in a garage dripping oil, and it's all dented. he didn't say anything, but I realized when I read the script late in August when we started, I exactly described the Millennium Falcon, and it's even written it's a pile of junk. And this is the interesting thing with George. See, he never said much. He'd written the book. There was a certain shyness there that everybody found difficult. I didn't. We there were only 5 of us in this little Lee Studios in London because Fox hadn't given any money. There was no money to start, but they took a little tiny studio and we all worked together. We had lunch together every day when he was there. And even these little things, as I wrote in the book, that instead of going to a restaurant with tablecloths and you're all formal and wine and all of this, I said, let's go to my favorite place, which was, she'd collected all sorts of furniture and lamps from kind of Morocco and Tunisia, and it was like a wonderful ethnic. We sat on sofas, and you sat on old, beautiful carved tables with Moroccan lighting. And I think that, without us having to say anything, there's another connection. You know, these things were kindred spirits. So he brought with him these 6 paintings by, as I kind of pointed out, really, I think in the book and in the documentary, which I'm just about, will get out soon, that Ralph McQuarrie is the unsung hero of Star Wars, and his paintings, there is Star Wars, there was the world. And so he painted that while George was writing the script. He had Ralph illustrate things, and I think, you know, it was not necessary any dialogue. George never told me what to make, how to make it, what he wanted. I relied on breaking the script down and not having any money. It's like, you know, because I think, as you know, we started making R2-D2 because without R2-D2 there wasn't a film, and there was no way to make him walk at the time. So that's another story. But I went to the gun hire place because I couldn't afford to make guns or to have the time. So I had this idea to use real World War I and II weapons because I could rent them and they would go back afterwards. That was cheap. And I stuck bits on them. And so making 2 of those, and I called George over, and this is the moment that you're talking about, because I got John Barry. I didn't tell them what I was doing. I just went to do it. I got John Barry to get George over to have a look at what I'd done. And it was kind of, that was the moment where I was on the right track with George, or it was bye-bye. You know, you go off and do other movies. George loved them. That was the Han Solo's blaster from the Mauser, because it looked like a science fiction cowboy's gun.
Yes.
And the Sterling, which I loved, and I would have used as it was without changing it, because to me it was a fantastic weapon, but sticking bits of T-strip and those scopes on it, George just held them in his hand. You could fire them. You got a puff of smoke, and there it was. There's the whole film, really, in that kind of little moment there. And he loved it so much. So he doesn't say, wow, this is great, fantastic. He smiles and held them. And then he stayed with me, and we worked with super glue, the 2 of us, and we stuck Princess Leia's gun together. He wanted to see what I'd done. And that, from then on, honestly, he never asked for anything. I just delivered. And he never, ever turned anything down that I delivered, whether it was a sets or robots, props, weapons, everything. I just serendipitously knew what he wanted and what my dream was. That's the thing, you know, I hero worship, like whatever graffiti and novels that I could find, and anything that, because I was different. Growing up in art departments, once I got the job as T-boy with John Box was the master at aged. It was on Oliver, and his sets of Dickensian London, I learned everything I ever used throughout my career from John Box. And if you ever watch, you'll see the seeds of why that sensibility was. The canals of England, everything, they were amazing. And I think that kind of what I'd always wanted to do and what I wanted to see, what I read, but I never saw on a film. We got Flash Gordon, we got, all of these, uh, Robbie the Robot, all good ideas, but no audience ever believed them. That's why Star Wars was the first movie to connect to an audience, because sadly, as designers and set decorators, if we've done our job well, nobody notices.
Yeah.
So
I was like, I remember when I first kind of found out about you, it was like, I think I was in college because there was always those stories of like how Obi-Wan's lightsaber was made, how Luke's lightsaber was made, and I like started looking stuff like, and then to find out like the Millennium Falcon, like this was all one guy, and it just kind of blew my mind. And like, can you kind of tell me, like, you touched it a little bit, like, you wanted like an oily ship and everything. Like, how did you approach like designing the Millennium Falcon?
well, those were the again restricted by so little money that we had. John Barry, I mean, you know the story. The original one was the Eagle, and they couldn't do it. So George said to um, uh, who was it? Joe Johnson, do it like a hamburger, and so that came across to us. They built the model of it. That's all that John Barry got, was the model that came, photographs in a pouch every week. So he built the whole thing, and I before we went to EMI and before the stages were taken over and he could do anything, I was driving around London in my Mustang that I had, and thinking, how on the earth am I going to make these look real, these ships? And I'd, I'd used some bits of old aircraft lights and different pieces to stick onto our wooden mock-up of R2-D2 to make him look a little bit better, to show George. And I thought, you know what, if I bought airplane scrap, I could stick it in these sets and make them look like a submarine. I'd been on a submarine, I'd seen one. And I think it's another of these links in sensibilities that I kind of walked into George and Gary and John Barry one day and crossing my fingers behind my back. And I said, listen, I've got an idea that to dress these sets, because we were not going to have the time to do it. And I have no budget. So if I bought scrapped airplanes, I could break them down and use the junk and put it in, and I could make it look like. And I honestly think, because George was an independent filmmaker, he was still young, we were all like students, and that he'd made THX 1138, having to do this himself on the streets of LA to make it look like a future world. They just said, yeah, go and do it. It would never happen anywhere else, I think. You'd be shown the door. I said, are you mad, boy? And I also bought tons of PVC piping that were drain pipes down to water pipes and sewer pipes, which are huge, and had a whole stock of it. I could just quickly layer that in the sets. And it's interesting how John built the cockpit first. Because of a lack of money, he knew it had to move around a bit. So he got truck tires and four big, like 4x2 wood posts, and the grips could move it like that. This is the low budget way of doing it. And he'd chosen Harry Lang and to be the draftsman and to art direct, and that was his job. Harry Lang was the art director on 2001. And that was kind of John Barry's idea. Well, he can do the Death Star stuff, that's got to look like that. So Harry was busy making these beautiful panels and doing it all like that. And I kept going down to him, and I'm still like an art student saying, I'm going to come and mess this up, don't you, Harry? And him looking down his nose at me a little bit because he was a far more superior art director. And finally he finished, and then he said, well, here you are. And I ripped his seats out and put in 2 fighter pilot seats that I thought were more appropriate, and started sticking bits in it. I found a way to sort of make the hyperspace lever, which never actually worked. I had to introduce Harriton to that and say, could you please do this for me, because I can't fix it. And that was the first set that they said, oh, get George down to have a look at it, because I dressed it. That was the final piece. So, George just smiled and loved it. The hold, which was going on, which was a huge endeavor for me, looked terrible. And I was buying truckloads of airplane scrap. I could honestly, no one wanted it. There were Derwent jet engines just in the rain, in piles of junk outside these airports. I don't think I spent more than £200 to get truckloads in and break them down to use for dressing everywhere. It's all out in Tunisia. It's everywhere. It's all crashed airplane parts. It saved my bacon, really, because I could do it. And it then, the thing was, it was a gamble, and I convinced everybody I could do it. But there was, it's like when you make a period film, there's plenty of reference you can get, and there was nothing to go on. And I was layering this scrap in. My prop boys were sticking it in, and you had to make it look engineered. That's the difference, that I knew how to do that. It looked terrible, and it kept building up and building up. And I thought, oh my God. But there was one day when we finally got the last pieces in, and it was encrusted, that hold, and we put oil drips and filled in little bits of letraset to give numbers on it, and lots of details. I noticed people coming onto the stage and their mouths open, kind of, where did you get this ship? How did you do this? And I knew then, okay, I think we've got the Millennium Falcon. And I had to do the same to the exterior. Do the same kind of technique. So it was, I just loved it when I saw it. I thought, wow, I've had the chance to make something here that looks so real that, no one's going to question this.
It has like so much personality. It's basically like just another character in the film, honestly. Like I can't see them flying any other ship around there. Like the Millennium Falcon is just the look of it, like it really kind of ties like most of the journey together, and yeah, you can just tell like the detail you guys took in it when you first built it. And you
I
were talking
agree. I
about
think
like
it's,
Harrison Ford was like helping you like with the shift, or I seen on a few interviews you're saying that he was pretty cooperative as far as like making sure all your stuff was working fine on the set.
oh, huge. He saved my bacon several times, and we, again, we connected because when I was talking to him one day, and I had to show him the guns and do all these things and show him the cockpit, and he, I understood he didn't want to go to parties and be with producers and do the usual film star stuff. We, knowing he was a carpenter, we put him to work in the carpenter shop, and he was happy. He was helping build the sets. That's Harrison. So he made that work. And you've seen on interviews that where George said, well, you're going to jump to hyperspace. And he said, well, how do you drive this thing? And George said, well, make something up. So that's true. So I gave him the tools of how to do it. The the biggest one, the challenge, was in the garbage incinerator in the Death Star, where I had to have a post that he could hold to try and hold the walls apart, and that took 2 10-foot drain pipes and whatever I could find to stick in the middle, and it never held straight. So I kind of, again, I told Harrison that right at the beginning, and he said, "Don't worry, Roger, I'll make it work." So he did. Bless him.
Yes, that's probably honestly my like favorite scene in A New Hope too is the trash compactor scene. Like it's just it there's just that little bit of comedy just mixed in with like the chaos. It's such a
Right.
great scene. And you can tell you guys like put a lot of work into like designing that set because there's you can't imagine that just a little tiny soundstage. It looks literally like you're in a trash compactor.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a nightmare for me because I knew these actors were going to be in water. We did it in the tank, so I knew they and Luke had to go underwater. So I thought I can't use metal; they'll get and it's squeezing in on them all the time. The polystyrene blocks that we used, if you break it, I'd seen this on other films. You see the white inside, so I thought, oh God! So I found the ways to dye it inside. I got my buyers, I drove them all nuts getting anything rubber, anything that was soft. And I had to fill it full of junk, which it was like that. And also, you know, you can't use paint that would be toxic for poor Mark
Yes.
because there was no underwater breathing or stunt stuff in that time. It was just get under the water, Mark, and get it done. And thank God, those three actors had such a sense of humor and such a camaraderie because George and John Barry and myself stuck by George's side, and when the rest of the crew didn't, we were such a tight unit, and the actors were with us. They understood that, so they kept it fun all the time, and they're fantastic. They just you can't imagine this world without them, and it's like you can't imagine the world without the sets or the weapons. It somehow worked out, and a lot of it, I have to say, by accident.
Yeah.
You know the story of 3PO's eyes. We and I'm telling the story. Bill Harmon, who's unsung hero, another one, died yesterday. I just got the notice here because he lived here.
My
And Bill,
condolences for the loss.
um, yeah, Bill was the Monty Python, made everything for them with no money, and I knew him. He'd done commercials for me, and he's very funny. So I got him hired, and we got him to make the wooden R2D2 to get that to work, and a land speeder mock-up. So Bill made 10 or 12 sculpture stands for Liz Moore to sculpt C3PO's head, because that was also the other thing we knew how important it was. So they sculpted it. Liz sculpted it down and got down to one head. We slowly talked and eliminated out of the 12 down to one, and there it was. And it was Ralph McCorris with the small square eyes. So in those days, we had tea ladies. They would bring round sausage and egg sandwiches and tea in an urn. You buy it for a couple of pennies. Bill would get that every day. And on the table were some old English pennies. And George, we were looking at it saying, it's the eyes, they're not right. And George literally picked up one of Bill's pennies and stuck it in his clay and stuck the other one in, and there was C3PO. They remained that size, exactly that, the whole time. So again, another kind of lucky accident, but in some ways I have to honor Bill as being part of that whole journey as well, that because of his sausage and egg sandwich, we got
Yeah,
C3PO looking like he does.
I saw that news. It's very sad of his passing and everything.
It's
It's
very sad
definitely
because it was sudden. I saw
major
him
in
not
Star
that long
Wars.
ago, and it was sudden, his wife said. And Bill was so funny and such a kind of friend to me and a legend, really. So I'm going to honor him. I have to do something all about him now and tell some of the stories because he was very funny.
Definitely, that'd be great. Now you were talking about like making C3PO and like R2D2. I saw there was like a lot of just making sure like you guys found just the right like actors with like Kenny Baker and Anthony Daniels to like fit those costumes.
Yeah, that Well, when we read the script, and John Barry and I and Les Dilly, the art director, was with us, we immediately realized that R2D2 and C3PO are the storytellers, and they had to work. Otherwise, George wasn't going to make the movie. And we knew C3PO because of Metropolis, made in 1927. And here we are, 50 years later. We knew that would work. They just got to find the right mime artist, and we could make him much better than that was 1927. If they could do it, we could surely do that. But measuring off Ralph McQuarrie's painting, R2D2 was literally 4 feet was the maximum. There was no way to do it. The radio control, despite what John Steers, the head of special effects, always said how great it was going to be, was very primitive. It hardly ever worked. And I remembered the Daleks, who scared the pants off me when I was a child. They had people inside them. So we kind of worked out, let's find an actor. And that was our first real kind of demand to George, you've got to find us an actor. And so he interviewed several. Deep Roy, who ended up in The Wizard of Oz. Deep was a little bit smaller, but he didn't have that strength. Kenny was very strong and very funny. They had a comedy duo, him and Jack Purvis. They would do funny jokes about being so small. And so he came in, and we decided to build a wooden mock-up around him. And then so Bill Harmon went to Robert Watts and said, can we have some funds? And he said, I haven't got any money. Sorry, there's nothing. George is paying all of you guys from his own pocket. We don't have any money. Fox haven't given us anything. So Bill had some wood at home in the garage, and it was a marine ply. He could steam it with his kettle, and we built that round. You've seen the photographs of the wooden one, and he built the legs so that you could put Kenny's feet through, and they were hidden. There's a beautiful drawings that I scanned, that Bill has the original papers, and there's a Monty Python letterhead with a very rough sketch of R2D2 on it. That's all we work from. There were no draftsmen doing work in drawings. I just sent them to George, actually, because he'd never remembered these. He remembered about Monty Python because he was asking Bill all the time how they made it. Very interested in it. I sent them to him for the museum, the scans of it, because no one's ever seen. And I said, I have a feeling that George did that little drawing. And Kenny couldn't make it walk. We tried everything. Then Bill had the idea, get his boots. So we got Kenny to bring his boots in, and we stapled those in the bottom of the legs, and he still could not move it. And when I grabbed some stuff like the lights from the airplane reading lights to stick in, and some air nozzles and little grids, I'd also grabbed anything I thought might be useful, and there was a fighter pilot's harness in there. I don't know why I grabbed that, but I did. And so Bill stapled that inside, and then Kenny was able to put it on, and he took the weight of R2D2. And with George and Gary there, he took 3 steps. And again, another, these are the most important moments, because those 3 steps before he fell over, we knew we could get him to 2-legged walk. We knew we could probably develop that up. And this, only when Norman Reynolds, the other art director, joined us late in November, he was on another movie. He took on C3PO, and he was designing new kind of innovative joints that could make the arm move like that in another way. And so he developed him up. We'd persuaded John Barry to buy this vac forming machine. It was a forerunner. There wasn't one in existence. I think it was £10,000, which John Barry didn't want to spend, but it saved our bacon. And they could print out in there from the clay models. They would make molds, and then they could print out the gold pieces for him. Do you know that because we only had 2.5 months before shooting, it was like insane. Once we started in January, once Fox actually said and gave the money, on the first day of shooting, it was the scene with Uncle Owen and Luke buying R2D2. That was the first moment standing there before shooting that he put the full suit on. And in fact, George showed me, I was at the ranch when he was digitizing the 6 movies for the Disney release of all 6. He was showing me, he said, look, you can see the gold tape holding it together. You could see there was black gaffer tape around Darth Vader, because on film it didn't show up. When it went to that detail in digital, he virtually redid the entire movie, special effects, everything, because it was all showing up, what never showed up before in cinema or VHS. So that's how, once we'd got him working, I found a laptop. Bill couldn't make one for 10 shillings in a scrap heap, lighting scrap heap, that just fitted. I carved his little arms at home with a penknife and a bit of balsa wood, because Bill couldn't do those. And we knew we had a movie then. And that's how it started, really. And the moment in EMI, with 2.5 months to get all this ready, it was just pretty insane dedication by the art department, really. We went down the first day of shooting. What's the first shot ever done on Star Wars was R2D2, who went out of control, crashed over, knocked other robots over, and John Steers ran in front of the crew and used the excuse that obviously worked in London traffic and said, "Oh, it's the taxis, they're messing up my radio control." Well, we were 3 miles up a dirt track in a desert shot, and another few miles from the sleepy little tiny Tunisian town who had one taxi. The rest were donkey carts or camels. That was about it. So that's what we did. We laid a board down, flat board, put a bit of sand on the front of it, and pulled him. Nearly every 3-legged mode shot on Star Wars is done by pulling him on fishing wire, which never showed up on film. That set off the shooting. How we did it. And George to this day said he thinks he got about 25% of what he was supposed to get, but he was such an acute editor. He could take little bits before the robots fell over or it didn't work, or they saw us pulling it, and he made it work. And it's interesting now, knowing this, if you go back and watch that whole sequence, they're not in it very much, R2D2, and he's really, the whole scene is about him.
I was seeing a thing you're talking about, like you saw a samurai helmet that was that initial like inspiration that kind of pulled you to Vader's helmet.
Yeah, so in the back, because I was digging around, that's where I found the bowcaster for Chewbacca. I loved it, showed that to George and said this will work better for a 6'5" hairy Chewbacca monster. And I saw they had an original samurai costume to rent out. And I don't know if anyone ever in England ever rented it, but I took the helmet, because it was black, into Lee Studios to show George and the sculptor, because the patina, after a few hundred years, it was beautiful. And the shape is exactly what Ralph McQuarrie had, because that's the only time that he was ever seen before. That was the Ralph McQuarrie painting, the two fighting with lightsabers. And so I took that in and showed them. And that was, that really, George, they in the end, they financed Kurosawa to make his movie when no one else would. He was such a mentor to George. And seeing it, that aged kind of beautiful pattern of the black and the shape of it, combined with there was a Nazi helmet, a few other things that came to light, but really the samurai helmets were the basis of what it was. So I was able to, we had that in the studio to show Liz, the sculptress, because she started the whole process there.
Yeah, it
I
definitely
found,
adds to the intimidation factor of it with like the shape of it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's and Ralph, Ralph is George's genius. One of them is his instinct was to hire people who only had a certain amount of experience, who'd never done this before, but he knew would figure out how to do what he wrote that couldn't be done. And if you look, Ralph McQuarrie was local. He was working at Boeing. And George saw something in him, and look at it now. I mean, I don't think there's a science fiction artist living who doesn't revere Ralph. And Ralph, Paul Bateman, my friend, who's a science fiction artist, who in the end helped Ralph and did his website for him and got the prints correctly like Ralph had done it. And he ended up selling all his work at all the fan expos and things. I mean, he told me that if whenever he went to see Ralph, if he saw if I was fiddling with a bus ticket, he'd do a drawing on it. That's all he did was drew. And I think his genius, when Paul told me that when I was making the documentary, I realized working at Boeing, he would draw jet engines for them and draw different things. He had an underlying mechanical sensibility, which is why these things worked that he drew. It's very clever, unsung hero.
Yeah,
I know Doug Chang very well, and Doug Chang has taken over. He said to me many times, he said, I'm thinking, how should I do this? I know. And he goes through the records and he said, Ralph's already designed it. It's already there in the archives.
yeah, his initial
So
drawings are
that,
just like beautiful.
yeah, stunning. Those paintings, they're Star Wars. There's the whole world in there. That's so, John Barry had designed Clockwork Orange for Kubrick, but he was relatively young as a designer. And he showed, first thing after Mexico, he flew up to see George and Ralph and explained to them how to do matte paintings, that if he could build half of the Millennium Falcon, we could do it full size, which we needed for the actors to go in. But he could do matte paintings for there and for the Death Star, the center power tower where Obi-Wan was on it. Ralph had to be taught, and he told me a funny story, Paul Bateman, that Ralph McQuarrie went home to do the first matte painting, and he'd read about them, and you have to do them on glass. And he thought, well, I don't have any glass and I don't have the money to get, oh, I know. And he took off the shower door and painted the first Star Wars matte painting on his shower door. And then it was worse. He had this old car. He had to drive it up to San Francisco, and he put it on top of his old car and drove it all the way up. I just love these stories because it puts a perspective on Star Wars,
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And one thing I haven't even asked you about yet, and it's probably my favorite thing that you created, and that's lightsabers. So what was that like big eureka moment like when you like first went into that room and opened that box of Graflexes?
Well, what I had realized was I couldn't make anything. I didn't have the time to make anything. So my buyer, Peter Dunlop, I said, just buy me old calculators, buy me old cameras, anything broken. We bought a full telephone exchange that they were pulling down. We got the whole interior. I would collect things because I like the shape. I didn't ever collect something and say, oh, that'll be this. I collected things that I could at some point use. I got so much stuff, honestly, in my room, I had to move out and move to the next room. I could not find anything that justified a weapon of the Jedi's. And it was getting near to the time of moving to Tunisia, and they were on my back saying, we've got to come up with this laser sword, as it was called then. And again, it was serendipity, really. I put together the binoculars. I super glued those from 3 different camera parts that I found and stuck them all together. And I thought, to make this look better, I'll put some lenses on the front. So I went to Brunnings, the camera shop that we could hire or buy anything from, bought 2 very cheap I could stick on the front. And I just happened to say, I said, David French, the manager, do you have anything? I've got to make this weapon, science fiction weapon. And he suggested torches, which were rejected immediately. And he said, "What? Look, there's a load of boxes under the shelf there. Go and have a look through those." And it was literally the first box I pulled out and opened, and the tissue paper, and there were 3 Graflex battery pack handles. And I honestly went, this is my holy grail. I've hit it. Because I pulled them out. They were weighty. They were beautiful. They were a lightsaber handle size. They had a red firing button. And I could have just used them like that. So I grabbed all 3, raced back to the studio, and everything I did on Star Wars, even like Chewbacca's, I would add something to it to change it 10%, 20%. And I had some T-strip left over from the blaster handle, the blaster barrels, and I managed to see I could get 6 around here. So, and then I got my super glue out. Nothing was done planned. I was just sticking it round, and I got 7 on. And then I'd broken down a calculator, and inside the bubble strip magnified the numbers. And the only thing I wasn't keen on was the grip that held it onto the camera. So that fitted perfectly. So I cut that in and called George over and said, George, you better come. I think I found a lightsaber. And really, again, that's another kind of momentous moment. And do you have the new Cinema Alchemist with George on the cover and his forward?
Yes.
In it, where he wrote the forward for me. So you see on there, that's what he points out and says, I still remember the day Roger brought me an old camera part and showed me a lightsaber. And he said, more than that, that was probably only one of 10 or 15 things he did that day. That's true. He held it, and there it was. There was the lightsaber, and it fitted. I don't know why, but it just was right. It felt right, the right weight. There's so much controversy over how many there were, but I made 3. I came up with the idea because I'd done art installations using front projection paint to get a glow. I came up with this idea because no one knew how to do it, that why don't we try it and put a rod in there? That was a meeting that's documented with the special effects boys, and the DP was there, who was a very grouchy, negative individual to George and all of us. He said, that's not going to work, and I don't want that light on my set. And George overrode and said, Roger, go and do it. Let's try it. And the special effects drilled out the end of my lightsaber handle and put in a motor that actually off-center vibrated, and it worked. We got a glow on set that was enough for them to rotoscope afterwards. And I just interviewed David French, the manager of Brunnings, because he still rents out the Graflex cameras because they were the go-to press camera in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Mm-hmm. He has a lot of them. And he was asked, well, what happened then? And he said, well, they called me actually and said, do you have any more? So he said, well, how many do you want? And he said, I ended up giving them another 30. So 33 Graflex handles went into the studios that we rebuilt or changed, special effects made versions of. And they asked him at the end, how much did you get paid? And he said, I got £850 for for 33 Gravlex handles. And now, and every time I speak to him, he said, "You've completely wrecked my business. I can't get any more spares. Every fan in the world takes them and spends a fortune." But
Now,
that was the lightsaber. And I every weapon I didn't just grab weapons. I wanted to match each one character. Like the Sterling, I knew would fit the blasters of a stormtrooper, and I knew that Han's gun was like a cowboy western gun. The Chewbacca's just worked. The Tusken Raiders, I found that to Tokyo Warriors Club from Africa, and because I thought, well, they're not going to have sophisticated weapons. They're like a tribe living in the nowhere. So I changed that by putting a bit of a mace in the end of it just to change it up. So Obi-Wan Kenobi's, I knew that he's an ancient mystic. His had to have that kind of different feel to it. And that one was made, there's a thing called a rifle grenade that was the only grenade you could stick in the end of a rifle and fire. So it was a grenade with a long spike on the end. There's a bit of a Derwent engine in there. There's a bit of a machine gun. That made that work. And I thought with Darth Vader's, it should be much more of the look of the Death Star and refined. So I handed that to the special effects boys. They couldn't get more of my Graflexes, but they found this MPP, which is same function, but with a different handle on it. And so that one kind of became Darth Vader's then. It's a funny story here. David West Reynolds wrote the Star Wars dictionary. It's a long story about David and how he came to be on Star Wars, but he had a little exhibition down in America last year, and they asked me if I would join him. And he said, I've got my replica of Obi-Wan's. He said, I've always had to ask you a question. I said, what? He said, well, on the end, there's a tap. He said, was it hot or cold? Because he'd got the end on it, and I think his was hot, H. So I laughed. I said, David, I never actually thought that I would leave a tap so obvious that you have to think, well, Obi-Wan Kenobi thought, oh, I know what to make my lightsaber. I'll go to the plumbing shop and buy some tablets. So I took it off when I showed him. We examined the film, and it's a gap at the end there. But there was a tap. It just worked. Whatever works.
and that was probably the first like lightsaber that like I found out a story, and that's what kind of led me to like finding out about you. It's like all these different pieces that just got put together and just made this crazy iconic weapon. Like, now, how did you feel when you watched the Obi-Wan Disney Plus series, and then they had the reveal that they had the original Obi-Wan like saber there in the box?
I was so nervous. I got through the series, and at the end, and then I realized, oh, he's going to have to dig up the lightsaber. And the story on, George commissioned my short film Black Angel.
Mhm.
So I was busy. So I wasn't, nor John Barry, we were both busy. We weren't doing Empire. The set decorator, bless him, I knew him very well. He should have stuck to period films. You have to know science fiction to be doing this kind of work. So he stuck rivets in the T-strip. I have no idea why, which appalled me because it turned it into a human-made thing. And this is a mystical weapon. And so that, unfortunately, went through the whole Star Wars saga as the weapon of Luke. So I was waiting, thinking, oh, and I revere Dave Filoni. I will hug him when I meet him finally and everything, because he dug up my original without the rivets, and I was so relieved.
Yeah,
Because that's what went on into Star Wars.
I was definitely because I as far as like the newer stuff goes, I'd probably say like Obi-Wan and Rogue One, probably my like favorites as far as the newer stuff. And like I
Yeah.
was just all into it. And then when I realized he was going to pull out the old sabers, and I saw like that original episode 4 Obi-Wan. I'm like, yes, that's what I wanted.
Yeah, it's good. For the documentary, Gareth Edwards, who directed Rogue One, who I think was the best of all the Star Wars movies, revering the original ideas. So I interviewed him at great length, and he goes right throughout my documentary explaining everything for me and kind of dividing it into chapters because I think he understood. And yeah, it was, those series are, well, Mandalorian, Dave Filoni brought it all back what the fans wanted,
Hmm.
when it had all gone astray. And I think, that the original visions of George, it's organically changed. Obviously, they could then do shinier ships and all sorts of stuff, and he changed it up. But I think once he'd established that world in the first three, everyone knew the world and loved it. So then he could change it up a little bit from then on. But it what we did out of desperate necessity, kind of trying to get this thing made, really changed science fiction forever. I think even now, Avatar, they use the same techniques. Everything from then on became used and real. It
Yeah,
it
you don't
it
really get much of that, like you described it, like plasticky, like clean sci-fi like vibe anymore. Everybody realizes like you can do way more stories if you have this like weathered and like worn like universe. Like it just makes it feel more real and immersive.
Yeah, it's something to do with us as well, because if you look at pyramids now, they're all broken. If you actually did them period correct, they were all shiny and painted in bright colors. That's how they were. You do that,
Hmm.
no one would believe you. It's just something in the world. And that was always my favorite world anyway, to be like that, kind of used and gritty. And I loved Bilal. I loved all the science fiction artists, Chris Foss, all of them who painted things as they saw it as a world that existed.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And
I'm glad because
oh, sorry, go on.
no, I'm just glad that we got the chance to go and do it out of necessity, really, that it was a desire, but also out of necessity. There was no one saying, no, you can't do that. No, you've got to make it shiny, or you've got to rebuild that, all of this stuff.
And like the other thing, like we talk about like the original trilogy and everything, and I'm sure a lot of people forget, like you spanned all through Star Wars. Like, how did George approach you to like work on Phantom Menace?
Well, after he commissioned my short film Black Angel because he hated the film they put out with Star Wars. And in those days, there was a 25 to 30-minute short and the film. There was no advertising, none of the other stuff. Um, and so he liked it enough to put it out in 480 cinemas and everything. And so that was another connection. And then on when he was doing Jedi, George was doing second unit, and he left Empire Strikes Back to Gary Kurtz and Erwin Kershner because he was establishing ILM and the ranch and everything, and thought, and he had such a bad time on the first one as a director anyway. I think he just wanted to let it go and trusted them to do it. And I think it's his least favorite film and it's the most favorite with adults because it's an adult film. George makes his films for 12-year-olds. That's what everyone has to understand. And he's told me many times, it's not my fault. Adults like them as well. And so he was doing the second unit, and then he realized he needed to be with Richard Marquand on the first unit. And I was waiting for the sender, my first feature, to get the green light. And they called me at home and said, what are you doing? And I told them, and he said, well, could you come and direct second unit for us? And I directed another short film that won the Academy Award for Best Dramatic Short that 82 or 81, I think it was. So I got a kind of enough reputation and experience. So they said, just come and take over. And I did. I drove up there and walked onto a set and did a huge action scene right off the bat. And so, and they knew enough with me then. I shot like Harrison coming out of the carbon freeze. They couldn't shoot him. They didn't have enough time. So I got to do that with Harrison. I was able to work with the actors, all of this stuff. So, and George was able to spend all his time on the first unit, and also he got me doing Ewoks. So I was 10 days of Ewoks. I kept begging George, can't I please come and do some other stuff? He said, no, I love what you're doing. Do some more, have a party. And I think in his head at the time, he was thinking about the Ewoks movie now in hindsight. But I was literally 10 days bossing Warwick Davis around doing somersaults and dancing. And so that kind of was done. And then George took a break for 20 years, and I'd been making movies and doing what I was doing. And there was a question of, while I was in Tunisia, one of the art directors had helped out doing whatever I needed doing when I was away for the dressing. He'd helped out. He suddenly came out of the woodwork and said, I deserve a set decorating credit. And John Barry had refused and said, no, that's not correct. This had come up to Rick McCullum, who'd taken over as producer. And I happened to be doing my sound mix in Oakland at the Sauzant studio. And when Rick got in contact with me, I said, well, I'm down the road. So he said, come up here and spend the day here at the ranch. So I drove up, met Rick. He said, come and see George. He wants to see you. And that's when I was very honored when I walked in the room with George. And he said, Rick, there were only 5 people stuck by my side to get Star Wars made, and Roger was one of them. And we spoke, and then they said, oh, come and see us in Leavesden. Just come and have a visit. So I said, okay. And while I was back in England then working, then I thought, you know what? And Rick said, why don't you come? And so I went, had a visit, and I realized afterwards why, because Rick and I and George, we met and talked. And then he said the designer who'd taken over wanted to meet me. And I walked into the designer's room, and he was immediately like full panic. How do I deal with George? He doesn't say anything, and I don't know what to do. And he was going on like that. And I said, listen, you've got the script. You've got fantastic pre-visits now from ILM, way beyond what we had. We had 6 paintings. I said, you do it. You show George. You draw it. You show him things. He will smile if he likes it, and if he doesn't like it, he'll tell you, and you'll change it with him, and you'll get it done. He's relying on you to bring it. He's not going to tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. I went next door to the set decorator, same thing. How do I do? I don't understand. He doesn't say. I mean, he was going like that, panicking, and I explained the same to him. I then went to the DP, who I'd happened to start. I did a huge commercial. I used to do them all in Rome, and we couldn't find a DP. And I'd seen David's reel when he was young, and I thought, wow, this guy's talented. I gave him his first big job, and we were friends. He'd done a few things for me. And he said, Roger, why aren't you doing second unit? We're shooting this film in 12 weeks. It's a 24-week shoot. George has only got 12 weeks. Why aren't you doing second unit? Because you did it on Jedi. And I walked back and I thought, well, and I asked Rick, I said, who's doing your second unit? He said, oh, we don't need one on this film, Roger. We've just got a few shots, and Ben Burt's going to do 1 day for us. That'll do it. I was thinking while he was talking, you're in denial. So I said, Rick, I love this world, and I would love to be back in it. So just put my name down. And blow me, when I don't know how many weeks before shooting, but not long, I got a call. What are you doing? And I said, I'm waiting on, I had to do on a film, another one that I'd done, and I was doing the Blu-ray color grading. And they said, well, can you come and just see George here? He said, are you serious about second unit? I said, sure. So I went there, I sat with George, and he said, well, how do you do it with your second unit? So I explained how, because the thing with second unit directors, they want to impress the producer to get a job. They're often doing stuff you don't need for the film. I'd worked that out, how to do it, and I showed George this little camera, and I had a thing called a clamshell, which was a very small Sony portable viewer you could use. George said, Rick, buy those right now. And then it turned around and they said, well, are you willing to do second unit? Can you do it? And I said, yeah, I put my name down on purpose. And they said, well, when can you start? And I said, well, I just got to go back to Vancouver and And then they both looked at me and said, listen, you've got 5 minutes. You've got to start now. So make up your decision. We're going to leave. So I made a call, and the DP said, look, I can go and do the color timing and all of that. So they came back, and I said, okay. They led me next door. There was already an assistant set up, a whole room full. And then they explained that because of the short schedule, our second unit had to be first unit, I think, on 6 different sequences in Phantom Menace where we went in first. So we're setting the lighting, we're setting everything. And I don't know if you know, but Rick McCullum produced the Young Indie series, and they had 2 crews shooting for 6 years, leapfrogging. So one director of photography with his crew would leapfrog. So they were highly trained crews. So I had the second crew, and they were all knew each other, and they were very skilled. And so I mean, like the big Senate where all the pods are flying around, we had to go in first, say on that one, and shoot and set that whole thing up. That happened a lot on Star Wars. And it was, we were in Tunisia because of Natalie Portman's dates. We were in August, in the week that the Tunisians called Suicide Week. It was never below 50. One day it was 60.
Oh, wow.
That was the place where I said we could fry an egg on R2D2's head. It was so hot, and we did, and it fried. Yeah, so I was back in that world, and I just loved it.
Now, you kind of so since you saw like the original and then the prequel trilogy, how did you feel the first time you saw like Phantom Menace? You saw like that new technology, like in the new CGI and everything, like in Star Wars.
Well, I had the benefit on. We had one, and I got to know John Knoll very well, and John was with us, and they pre-vised like the Senate. It was already pre-vised. I could go on the computer and see what lens to take and where to shoot from. All of this, it was just like so different to what we were used to, and so we had one ILM artist with us the whole time, and I still like when we did the shooting of the pod races from the valley. The Tusken Raiders were up there shooting them. I remember I said to George, I said, I just want to go out of nostalgia, and I think it's good luck. I want to go back to the valley where you shot, where R2D2 got zapped in the valley like that. And he said, well, are you sure? Because you have to get up by donkeys, all the equipment. I said, no, we'll go and do it. They cursed me. But we had the same thing on the first film. George had got an old Gunga Indian movie cut together to that sequence. He used bits of any film he could get, World War II dogfights, to put it together. Now I had better previs stuff that I could match exactly what we were doing. So all of that came together, the difference was that here the crews were reverent to George. I mean, they were loving it, whereas on the first one, the entire, really, all the British crews were so rude to him all the time, and there was no belief in this thing. It was hard work to get it up there. That was very different. And I had to do a lot of of um, a lot of the shooting with Darth Maul, the fights. I had a lot of that to do, which was amazing, both in the desert and on the stage, because obviously that's second unit, and when there's not enough time, George will shoot the main actor stuff, and then I shot a lot of the action with Dave Park. It was just amazing.
That's
A lot of
amazing.
the battle scenes. I got to shoot when R2D2 meets C3PO for the first time, when Anakin's making him, you know, and that wonderful line when he's beeping out and he's going, "What do you mean naked?" Uh, Carrie Fisher wrote that line. I don't know if you know.
Really? I did not know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. She wrote some of the juicy lines of Phantom Menace, but all of that together, um, I had to shoot a lot of Jar Jar's material, a lot, um, and then seeing it, it was, you know, and I tell everybody now, George got hammered for Jar Jar, and nobody understood. This is not an adult's film; it's a 12-year-old film. They loved Jar Jar Binks; it was their favorite character, kids
Yeah.
at the time. And I remember speaking to George, and I said, "How do you deal with this? Like being called a racist? If anyone's not a racist, it's George." And he said, "I don't read it. It honestly, if it's good, you get fluffed up your ego, and if it's bad, you just feel distraught." So he said, "I read nothing anymore. I don't look at magazines, reviews, nothing. I just do my job, and I'll get on with the next film." And it was very good advice. Um, and uh, it's just the pod race alone, for anybody going to the cinema, that is worth the price of admission.
Yes. It was a great, great,
And
great sequence.
I shot a lot of that. I shot a lot of the crowd scenes and all sorts of stuff like that. And I mean, to me, it was just such a joy doing it and seeing the movie. It came together, and I thought, well, this is a huge, huge, powerful movie. And I have to say, and nobody else seems to have noticed this, but Watto is the first fully realized acceptable CGI character in the history of cinema. No one's ever questioned him, but he's a full CGI living character. He's extraordinary the way that you believe him. So I just, you know, I've always championed it, and now, thank goodness, it's, you know, it went out to number 2 in the box office when it got re-released, and I think now people are realizing actually this is a really great movie just to watch.
I've always said Star Wars, it ages like wine. Like there's a lot of times where like a movie will come out, people don't quite get it right away. A few years down the road, those kids get older and they have that attachment from like their youth, and you know they get it, and then it finally kind of gets its flowers a little bit later. But it's yeah,
Yeah, I think you're right.
they're
And,
great.
and a lot of really good work. It's like Blade Runner. I mean, it got so crucified. It made no money. It never stayed in cinemas for more than a few weeks.
Mhm.
And yet it's a science fiction masterpiece. So, you
Amazing.
know, the world of cinema is littered with movies that came out before their time, but that's what is innovative. That's what's great. And I think George has independently pushed cinema into what we get today. When you go to cinema, the sound and the vision and everything, it all goes down to George reinventing sound and editing, everything, special effects. And the difference with George, it was never ever used for effect. It was used to tell a story. I think that's what people underestimate with him.
Yes. And another thing, as far as like people finally starting like to recognize things, I've noticed too that you've been doing like a lot of recreations of a lot of your lightsabers recently, and I've absolutely loved
Well,
seeing them. I'm glad that everybody's finally kind of giving you the attention you deserve. I recently I was looking at the Theory Saber one that you did. It was very beautiful. It looked exactly like the description went with that first one.
yeah, it's interesting that because I've been very quiet about it all, and then the book David West Reynolds forced me to write it and said, "There's only you. There isn't anyone in this world who knows all the stories. You created this huge universe, Roger. You created the first lightsaber." So I've always been very quiet. When the book came out, I realized the publishers do nothing. So I had to go on the road. So I was doing podcasts, and I'm doing these now, and then I started doing some events and signing photographs, and I realized the connection to people and fans is what I love, and why George made these movies, and why for families. And I get so many people in tears, people talking their stories. Everybody universally says, it changed my life. And that's part of what the power of what George kind of did with Star Wars. It was all on purpose. So I then was Theory Sabers. I love what he does. He's the voice of the fans, and he's got such a huge following that he's able to be quite truthful about stuff and gets in trouble. But so we did an hour and a half podcast, and during that podcast, that's when it came up and said, the lightsaber. And he had decided a year ago that as he's such a fan and he knows this world and does things so well, that he decided to do his own lightsabers and wanted to do them better than anyone else, which he's done. And so he then said, would you be willing, or why don't we do your origin saber, the one that you kind of put together before you showed it to George? So I said, wow, that would be amazing if I could do that. So we did it. And I didn't know that it would work. I didn't know that people would want this. This 200 sold out in 3 hours. I mean, it was just shocking. And
Yeah,
it's beautifully made. I mean, it is.
it's
And
so
I
gorgeous.
even did, yeah, and I just did it. I put in Easter eggs and said, this is really like the original. And I only put in 6 of the T-strips because that's what I first put round, and then it was only by hand when I stuck it. I found I made 7, so I did it like the very original one. It's beautifully made, but the thing is, I'd always had this red button that was never used. Luke, to use it, had to use the bubble strip to fire it up. So I said, if we can make the red button work, you're gonna my dream for like 40 years. So we did all of that.
And so
And
many other
it's
companies don't make that button functional. That was a huge
no,
thing for like people for that button to be functional.
I agree. It's like a huge part of it. So then he said, can we do another one? I said, well, this is my story. And I said, when I was directing second unit on Return of the Jedi, I noticed that this same set decorator who put rivets in mine, they'd lost Darth Vader's lightsaber, so they had to make a new one which fitted it for Return of the Jedi. It fitted the canon. And I guess only out of laziness, he'd just taken Obi-Wan Kenobi's and changed one little thing on it. And I kept thinking to myself, what a wasted opportunity. And so I said, recently, I always had this story that when he got that costume on out of necessity, he would have gone and found the crystal that fitted to his, like the Jedi's had to do, and he would have forged a lightsaber that matched it. So that's what we're doing now. That'll be my Star Wars origin saber. We have a thing now. I've got the origin forge, so I'm making those. So that one we're going to, I think he wants to get it done and release around May, which I can do as well because they're my origins. So I'm not upsetting Disney. I'm not, Lucasfilm let me do whatever I want. I'm part of the family, but Disney are more wary about stuff. But I can do that because it's what I think. Even now, as a cosplayer, as a Darth Vader, I would like a lightsaber that was what should be with that wonderful costume, you know? So that'll be
Absolutely.
the next one. So I don't know. Everyone tells me that's going to be very popular. So I hope so, because I'm still trying to make the feature of Black Angel, the first short film, and we've been waiting 4 or 5 years for the funds, and it's all written and costumes done and everything. But getting funds nowadays is so difficult. And it's given me a kind of lease of life that I love doing. And so my eldest son has now said, I'm going to take this over with you. I want to do your origin stuff. He said, everyone wants these stories. There's no one else has them. So we're going to do a whole universe around this, around
Amazing.
and more. Yeah. And it's not for ego or anything. It's just to create. I know from meeting fans personally, so many now, I'm doing them in the States, and I know how nobody bothers. Like the book is still unknown, so I need to get all this out there, because this film will be studied in for infinity and universities, everything. And I'm very, I keep myself out of the ego. Like George, he's the same. I keep myself just centered on the ground, but I know the importance and how, it's like doing this podcast. People want to hear the stories, and it's all it does is I'm mentoring people to find themselves. There is truth in this, that you can find who you kind of are, and it doesn't matter what you're doing or what you believe in or anything. It's just, this is what the Luke Skywalker story is. He was a lost kid stuck on a desert planet with dreams, and destiny came down, and he was kind of forced to take another route by choice, and he recognized those moments. And then he should have been up to episode 9 when it should have concluded the Luke Skywalker story, that kind of went astray when it went where it went. But I know what George would have done with it, and I think, I just, the interactions and just seeing the belief in people, that it's changed their lives, it's given something to believe in. It's very important to me, because this is a lost world we're living in now. There's chaos all around us, and
You need escape
you have to
sometimes.
find yourself. You have, yeah. It's the times are very changing, vastly. And I think it's just good to know that this all sprang from a group of kind of broke cinema revolutionaries with no money, who put things together and created something. And I think that story can influence everybody, and it it may influence somebody to go and be a filmmaker. It may influence somebody to go and write. It may influence somebody to become a podcaster, to do whatever. I think that's empowering people to be who they are, and that's very important. So that's why I'm doing all of this. And it
Yeah,
just so happens that, and when you look, everybody in the world wants a saber, lightsaber. It was just a brilliant invention by George. My son
iconic,
has
I guess,
about
by pop
8.
culture today.
Yeah, yeah. And who doesn't want a sword of light, to play
Exactly.
with? And now look at it, mine that I could only dream about. Now you can fight with them. They have sounds and lights and blades that work. Everything. It's just amazing. I
Me and my
wish
kids
we
both
could have
have
done
one,
it
so
then. Yeah, yeah.
and
It's a
I'm
fun
I'm
world.
I'm so glad now that people are finally understanding, like, that you are a big part of the Star Wars culture, and that a lot of the feel and the look and what we all love about Star Wars wouldn't be there without you. And I honestly, I plug your book anytime I can. Any of my friends, I think it is a
Thank you.
required read for a Star Wars fan. Like, it just gives you so much in-depth, like, stories to that original trilogy, and it's all just fascinating. And I just want to thank you
Yeah.
so much for coming on my show. It is an honor.
No,
Like,
it's.
you are my first ever
Thank you.
interview, and I can't believe it's an Oscar winner.
Thank you. Well, if I can get a bit of revenue out of the next lightsaber, then I'm going to do a audio book out of the book, because everyone keeps telling me we want to hear you tell these stories. So that I will get done, because the publishers won't do it; they won't invest in that. So I'll do it.
Yes, that would be fantastic, and I think everybody would love to have an audiobook version. Like,
Yeah, I
definitely,
think so, and
like I
I'll
said,
tell more
it's a required
stories.
read for a Star Wars fan. It's fantastic. The stories in here are great. There's so many things that you just don't know until you read it.
Yeah,
But
nobody
I like I
knows
said, I
how we
just want
did
to
it.
thank you
There
so
isn't
much.
anybody. John Barry died. Yeah, John Barry died young, and Les Dilly and Norman Reynolds were just basic art directors who got things done. John and I had to create everything. So, and even John says I had to do all this, the breaking down of the universe, and in those days the set deck had to do the robots, the weapons, the props, the sets. I mean everything. Tunisia. So it all came under me. So there was no time for anybody. And as you know, at the end of the film, everything was destroyed. I mean, nothing, because there was no faith this film would even get shown. So even to the extent when David West Reynolds, who was an archaeologist, realized that they should be parts of an archaeological history, the way we shot, he called London um, to Robert Waltz, who said, "All I can tell you is when you leave Tozeur heading for the Algerian border, you turn left." Well, there's 200,000 miles of desert shot. And Rick McCullum had to take the crew back to Tunisia and was just distraught. There were no records. No one knew where we shot. And so he flew David West Reynolds, who'd gone on his own money with clips of the film and found every shot, more than that, each angle that we shot. And they hired him. And then he got hired and became the head of literature and wrote the Star Wars dictionaries.
Wow, it's
Yeah,
incredible.
so yeah, and David's unknown too, so I'm trying to help to get him recognized now.
This has been like one of the greatest moments of my life is getting to meet you and speak to you and just talk about Star Wars and lightsabers and all that stuff. Like, I want to thank you so much for coming on my show and just giving me a little bit of your time. Um, I'm actually going to be coming to Rebel Scum Con later in the year, so hopefully I get a chance to actually meet you.
Yeah, that would be good. And
So,
then send me a link to when you put it out, because then I'll put it
yes,
out with
absolutely.
others.
Yes, and like I said again, fantastic honor, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I will keep
Thank you.
spreading the word about you and all the great work you've done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. I'm glad, happy you're doing it. You're all doing great stuff.
Thank you. I'm glad you appreciate that too. I again, we have the great Roger Christian here with us, and just like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.